Apologies for the delay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Saffron Brown. I'm the school health professional here at West Island School. With me this evening, I have Claire Howarth, our Vice Principal for Pre-16, and Calvin Liu, our school counsellor, and our guest for the evening, Stephanie Young. So welcome to this evening's webinar on identity. Certainly feels like discussions about gender and sexuality are increasing. This may be because young people have increased access to information, space and vocabulary to articulate and explore these ideas in these areas of teen development that have always been explored. This evening's webinar will be delivered by Stephanie, whom some of you may have seen in our mental health Q&A webinar a few weeks ago. Stephanie is an educationalist and a counsellor at Central Health, and her professional areas of interest include interpersonal relationships, sexuality, gender identity and adolescent challenges. I'm delighted to introduce Stephanie, and we'd welcome your questions in the Q&A box, which we can discuss at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Saffron. Good evening, everyone. If you'd just be patient while I set up my presentation. And let's make sure we do this correctly here. Okay. So I am very pleased to be here this evening. I initially want to thank West Island School for providing this space to speak about such an important topic. There are many of you here tonight, so I'm confident that this is directed at an audience that is interested and intrigued and most importantly, interested in ways that they can help their child and adolescent, work through this stage of their life. I've got a presentation that's broken into about 6 sections tonight, and I'll stop at the end of each section just so you can gather your thoughts, but feel free to put those questions in the chat so that we have as much to work through as possible at the end. I'll try to keep it within 45 or 50 minutes, but I tend to be a bit chatty. I'm a counselor after all, so which is rather ironic because I do a lot of listening. But my hope and my goal tonight is just to share a little with some of you or a lot with others so that you have some new insights into your teenager's world. Okay. So off we go. Like I said, 6 general categories. We're going to look at what identity is and the theoretical and kind of foundational aspects of identity, just so we can understand why this topic is so important and how both of these aspects of identity fit into what we understand is occurring at this stage of human development. Of course, we'll delve into sexuality and gender. The presentation's a bit more heavy on the gender side, and it could just be based on my observations from working with quite a few clients who are struggling with their gender identity. I see more gender clients. I don't know if that's a little bit too simplistic of a way to identify these clients. More grappling and struggling with gender than sexuality. And we can guess possibly this is because sexuality and sexual orientation has been in our narrative for more years. There's more progression in our understanding of human sexuality. Maybe it's just a bit more mainstream than some of the language around gender, which we know for a lot of people is quite new. We'll also talk about your role as a parent, how to talk about these topics, how we can approach them, some ways to support your team, and then when to ask for some help. So quite a bit to cover, but I've tried to touch on all topics. And of course, at the end, I'll leave my information so you can reach out. I'm happy, super interested in emailing and connecting to see if I can assist you any further. So let's get started. Okay, so yes, like I said, a little bit of the theoretical and sort of psychosocial aspects to get us started tonight, just so you can understand where this all fits in. And so we do know that identity, right, is one sense of self. Right? And there are multiple aspects and facets of our sense of self that help define who we are. Our physical sense of self, right? I am almost 6 feet tall. I am of, Western European descendancy. So I have certain physical characteristics that mark that. Our sense of self is defined by those interpersonal characteristics. Are you a good communicator? Are you a strong team worker? And so on and so forth. Those interpersonal characteristics are also connected to the psychological ones, right? Some of us generalize our understanding of self when we say, oh, I'm an introvert, or, oh, you're an extrovert. But we have lots of characteristics that are psychologically grounded, right? These are our beliefs and our values about ourselves, and so on and so forth. And then the last, or one of the last, I guess, larger aspects of our sense of self is defined by those social roles that we are affiliated with. Your ethnicity, right? Are you part of an organized religion? I put involvement in sports. I'm going to use myself a lot as an example tonight. I'm going to flash myself back to my painfully awkward adolescent years, because I think it's a good example of sort of how we can all flash back to try to put ourselves in the shoes of our adolescents. So it's all these aspects that really define our sense of self. And we do know that identity has some continuity over time. However, in adolescence, this is when we see many changes. So you might think, okay, well, how do we form identity? And if we think of this as sort of a threefold relationship, the interpersonal one is significant. This starts when your adolescents were little, right? As a parent, you get to influence all sorts of aspects of who they are. I think of my two children, they're still school age, they're young, not yet into puberty. I am almost there, but I have quite a bit of influence over what they do, who their friends are, who they interact with. So I still can hold on to that control. But as they start to get a little bit older, the individual component really rises up, right? And this is where we see adolescents experimenting with different roles and different behaviors. I don't know, missing curfew, right? Pushing back in a class. And I don't know, I mean, I don't see this a lot here, but I think back to when I was in school and sort of talking back to the teacher a little bit, not doing homework, right? All of these experimental behaviors that push back against the roles of the society around them is what helps them figure out who they are. We know that gender and sexual orientation can fit into this, but it's not a mutually exclusive relationship. One can identify aspects of gender and sexual orientation based on those interpersonal relationships, right? The social relationships, which is the third aspect of how we form identity, right? What's our ethnic composition? What career goals do we have? And so on and so forth. So we know that there are different components to this formation, and it's not linear, unfortunately. We can't just check boxes off as we drag our adolescents through this stage of life. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. So just a tiny bit of theory. If any of you have taken psychology in university, you would know about Erik Erikson. There are other, Piaget, Kohlberg, other, experts in psychosocial development. I really like Erikson's work because it's really simplistic for how I use it in the counseling setting. And it's simplistic in the sense that it gives me a framework for the person that I'm working with. And with adolescents, we know that stage of life, and Erikson has broken down human development into stages. And with adolescents, that particular stage of life has a really defined struggle. And Erikson says that all stages of life have these struggles and that we try to come out the other end intact, right? And that there's a sense of accomplishment within that stage. Erikson's work is 50, 60 years old now, but at the time was really valuable because it's looking, stepping away from Freud's work and looking more at how children develop within a context, right? They're not just isolated products of us. As much as we would like to think they are us, they are really just through us. So if we think about his work when it is really pertaining to this age group, the key thing that is meant to develop is the sense of fidelity. Right? So 12 to 20 is a really broad age range. But the core struggle that's happening here, again, is this sense of, right, who am I? How can I come out of this being true to myself, as opposed to being confused, right? Drifting, being unsure, right? Unsure of who I am and what I believe. So this theory, hopefully, is a basis for you to put the gender and sexuality stuff in, right? To kind of set it on so that we can understand why there is this push-pull of exploration and this push-pull of sorting, one's sense of self. So that, I don't want to get all doom and gloom here, but I do work with adults in my counseling practice and quite a few young adults as well. And I often see that there is this tie back to adolescence and a sense of self that is sometimes a bit shaky. And in adulthood, we see that come out in our life, and it's not always explicit, but our identity and that security around who we are sits at the core. And knowing that, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to allow your adolescent to make some sense, right, of what they believe in, what is that belief manifesting in the way they act. We're really trying to get everything to align outside with what is happening in terms of belief on the inside. And, I put life is smoother. Good Lord, we know it's definitely not easy, especially right now. I mean, nothing is smooth about our life in Hong Kong right now. But this is one thing that we can really keep in mind when we are, conversing with adolescents. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm taking a sip of water. Briefly discussing sexuality. We, at minimum, I hope that everyone walks away tonight with a few little nuggets or tidbits of information. And one is that sexuality is not to be conflated with how one expresses gender. I hear this quite a bit, that there is this assumption that if someone is, born with the sex organs that are identified as female, and they grow up and start to feel uncomfortable in that female gender, that they must therefore be gay, right? And there's a lot of jumps in logic. And we know that your anatomy does not determine your sexual orientation. Sexual identity, in fact, is based on our behavior. And we know that sexual behavior is not just for reproduction purposes, it's also for pleasure. We also know that our sexual identity is based on our attitudes, right? These beliefs that we have, beliefs that we learn from our parents, our formal and informal education, what our culture tells us, and it's all based on those attitudes. Our identity is based on the activities, how we display our sexuality, and then of course the orientation piece, right? Who are we attracted to? The Trevor Project, this is a screenshot that I just noticed is not correctly cited, so apologies there. But this is from the Trevor Project, and they're a US-based nonprofit who work with LGBTQ kids with the main goal of suicide prevention. So they do a lot of support work, a lot of education work. And the reason I wanted to share this tonight was just to demonstrate this idea of sexuality being very broad, being what you can call a spectrum, not this idea of a binary heterosexual or homosexual situation, right? Kinsey, a researcher decades ago, really got the ball rolling with this idea that it's not that simplistic. There are not two ends on a spectrum, right? That there's actually a lot in the middle. So with the youth that the Trevor Project work with are demonstrating that, sure, almost half are pretty concretely certain that they are gay or lesbian. Another third, yeah, I think I'm pretty clear, right? I'm in this bisexual sort of state of orientation. But the something else part is what I find so beautifully demonstrative of us as a human species. Sure, the language is absolutely mind-blowing. I can't keep up, and I talk to teenagers about this all the time. So we'll talk about the language later, but this again is just showing us the breadth of how people identify and the significance of the numbers. It's pretty fantastic, right? So on the other hand, right, because we're not conflating gender with sexuality, right? We know that gender is in the mind, not between the legs, to put it directly. This graphic, this little image I find works well. I see this, or a version of this, used in schools quite often. So we have our little unicorn here, and you can see that the rainbow, the identity part, is a thought bubble, right? It is the construct that is coming from, which I'll talk about, society and culture, that is in the mind, right? How I identify as this in my mind. The expression, as you can see that it's surrounding the unicorn, is the outward expression of the gender, be it clothing, right? Physical attributes, haircut, accessories, all of those things. The sex that is assigned at birth, we know, is the biological component, right? So that is down below. And then the heart is where the orientation and the attraction part fits in. Right? And if you have a really dialed in young adolescent, and most of them are with this language, they can even discern the difference between a label to do with sexual physical attraction and emotional attraction. There's a really precise body of language around this. So I hope this visual helps a little bit just to discern between all of the different pieces here. So what do we know about gender? This is a single slide that really does the topic a lot of injustice, but I have to keep an eye on the time tonight. But we know that transgender people have been documented, apologies for the typo, back to the ancient Greeks, right? This is not a new trend. And I hear the word trend from parents a lot. And statistically, we're not looking at a significant change, but what we're looking at is a significant increase in a narrative that has a space to exist. And that's the internet, that's social media, that is all of these spaces that I'm also largely unaware of in my increasing age. So it's not to be considered a trend, it's just to be considered more visible. We know that gender is a social construct. It's really culturally dependent. I grew up in a mid-sized Canadian city, and I grew up exposed to gender being expressed in a real particular way. I played a lot of sports, so I had a little bit of variation in my expression of how I dressed, right? It was socially acceptable for me to dress, in sports attire, and it was sports attire in the 80s and 90s was definitely not as cool as it is now. So, my understanding of that social construct of gender is one thing. And after spending the last 10 years in Hong Kong and observing how people express their gender here, this definition is really cemented for me. It makes complete sense that a society and a culture defines what gender is. We know with some research on this topic that little children who express some gender confusion are less likely to persist with this into adulthood than those who show confusion in adolescence. We could pin it on the onset of puberty. It's difficult to define. There's no blame to be had. It's not a parenting error or I don't know. I mean, I've heard of all sorts of things, right? Behaviors of the mother while the child was in utero. I mean, there's all sort of horrific attempts to blame. There's no blame, right? It's just, it just is. So, you know, and that's something that we don't have time for tonight, but I know it is a concern of a lot of parents. Terminology-wise, we know that the term transgender is relatively new and all of the language around it. Even in my lifetime, I can remember, I mean, I'm in my, I don't know if this is social faux pas to say it, but I'm in my early 40s. And I think back even to, as you know, as a child and hearing language that my father would say, you know, it's quite different from the language that in the last maybe 2 decades has evolved. So the terms are new. And the statistics part is a bit difficult because the collection of data around gender is really poor. You know, in Canada and in the US and parts of Europe and you know, other nations, there's a push to include a third gender in, I don't know, a census and data collection. But I don't see it here in Hong Kong, right? I don't see that option on any of the forms at my children's international school. You know, so it's a really difficult topic to collect data on simply because of the way that people identify and also the lack of space for them to publicly identify. So in the States, some of the research is working with this idea of around 2% of the population. But again, that's just looking at people who clearly cross-identify as the other gender. So three takeaways that we're going to add to my hopeful short list of takeaways tonight are these misconceptions, right? And one is that if we look at a baby's genitals at birth, that will determine their core sense of self, right, and their identity. And we are conditioned to do this. I mean, I have two boys, right? And I have received over the years only gifts from that half of Toys R Us. And this is what we're up against, right? And we need to understand that our young people who are not comfortable in their bodies are up against this as well. Right? And you know, that's why it's so important to talk about this. Another misconception is that I talked about it, sex and gender are the same. They're not. How you express your gender or how you identify with it does not necessarily equate to any orientation, right? Those of you, I'm really direct sometimes, but those of you who are out there and maybe there's a heterosexual pair right now, a partnership viewing this, I can't imagine that your desire would be any less for each other if one of you was wearing a man's sweatshirt, right? Or a traditionally feminine, I don't know what, hat. Bad example, but I have to really make sure that we separate those two. And the other misconception, again, is this idea that I hope you're walking away with tonight is that there are not two simple binary genders. North American Indigenous cultures have had this version of a two-spirit, a special person in the community who portrays all aspects of gender. And this goes back in Indigenous history in, you know, forever in all sorts of parts of North America. So we have this history to show us that it's nothing new. So we're cruising along here. This is where the language starts to get a bit tricky. So I've tried to simplify it tonight. I'm not an expert in everything. I have the honor, the privilege to work with a lot of gender cases. I mentioned that within our child development team. So I am also learning. I do not know it all, but it does help to know the basics plus, right? And we'll get to that. Transgender refers to people who strongly cross-identify. You don't call someone a transgender. It's not polite, right? But we can refer, as we see in the third phrase over here, a trans boy or a trans man is acceptable to say, or a trans girl or a trans woman. These are people who are assigned female at birth but identify as male, and vice versa. And of course, our assigned sex is that genital observations at birth, which is legally in most places still required. Right? Non-conforming, which is probably for me the most frequent client that I see, the most common, is a person whose behavior just falls outside of those societal norms, and they're feeling fluid, diverse, expansive. I'm not a huge fan of the word variant, because to me it implies that there's a variation of what should be right, that there's something wrong, but that could just be my issue with the word. Right? Cisgender, you may hear more and more. Cisgender, I consider myself to be a cisgender woman. So I was, my assigned sex is female, and I typically express feminine-ish, whatever that means. I don't know. Yeah. So some common identities, and like that slide with the sexual orientation names and different labels, there are so many. And I only want to go through some of the common ones just so that you have a starting point. For some people, the label is actually rather irrelevant, but for some people, a label helps clarify and give strength. So we just have to communicate that, right? Gender neutral, gender free, agender is just that ambiguity. I'm not really connected to anything. I think we know androgynous a little bit more in our common contemporary language. We see a lot of high fashion can be very androgynous sometimes, right? It's sort of simultaneously masculine and feminine in certain ratios. Gender fluid is just this idea that the expression changes. A demi boy or a demi girl, I hear this sometimes, where there's a partial identification with one or more gender. Non-binary is just not sitting at either end, right? Neither cisgendered female, cisgendered male. And then pan, and you may hear your young person refer to someone who is pansexual. This is just this multiplicity of identity and expression. And the same would go in terms of sexual orientation. Someone who is pansexual is attracted to, in essence, a person, not so much their sexuality. Okay, so moving on to the part that I'm sure we are curious about. And just again, I don't have all the answers. Yes, I'm a parent, and I struggle with all the things that everyone does, but I'm basing these next slides largely from conversations that I have with adolescents from the back end of the family relationship, right? So the big question, what if I make a mistake, right? What if I say something that is irreparable? And I wish I could say that this conversation is always easy, because it's not. But like anything, the power of vulnerability, I am convinced, will break down all errors. The apology that you can provide and the commitment to speaking correctly about what your child is experiencing has such a significant impact on your relationship. So do not be afraid to make the mistake, but if you do, make sure you own it. So I thought I'd give parents a minute to reflect, because before any conversation occurs, I truly believe there needs to be an understanding of where we as parents are coming from. We bring in a lot, especially with these topics that make us afraid, that we are unaware of. So it really helps to spend some time thinking about it. And I know the 30 seconds you're going to get right now is not enough time, but here are some starters for you to consider. Think about how you have expressed these aspects of your identity. Have you been very, has there been continuity largely throughout your life? Or have you expressed gender and sexuality differently at different times? Think about conformity. Have there been times in your life where you have felt the weight of having to conform? Are you aware of the fears that you have that influence how you parent? And we all have fears. I think of the fears I have about my young humans getting hurt, failing at things. I mean, we all have fears, right? And then this one's a tough one, maybe. I don't know if we always know if we're emotionally intelligent and equipped. But working on this language around emotion can really help conversations with your kids or your adolescents around this topic. Couldn't help with, couldn't help but put in the cheesy meme. Reading your teen, I mean, you know that timing is everything. And I don't have a guidebook for how to bring these conversations up. But I do hear from them that their parent or parents come in their room at the worst possible time and they want to talk. And again, you know your child, but are you barging in their room, or are you trying to carve out that space and give them that respect by not interrupting when they're gaming with friends? Now I find that some young people like to be out doing something, or they're in the car and there's less of that pressure to be in the spotlight. It's tricky. And one thing I wanted to make note of is how you navigate the sense of a void. So have they shared information with you, maybe come out or shared something personal, and you reacted poorly? Do you feel that distance? Right? I hear this a lot from young people, that they claim they try to leave a little trail of information and then, details, and then they try to indicate to their parent that they would like to use a different pronoun, or they don't feel X, Y, and Z. And the reaction closes them up. Right? Maybe they asked to be called he, to explore that and see what that feels like. But then you as parent continue to use the pronoun she. And this sense of being unheard and unseen really will make future conversations difficult, right? They close down. Extending that to this idea of the approach, you've thought about your own fears, your own influences. Maybe you come from a religious background that doesn't always talk about human sexuality outside of traditional heterosexual norms. I'd like you to think about what culture you've created in the home. Do you use language that is unintentionally transphobic or homophobic? I understand there are cultural differences. I can't see all the faces in the room tonight, but I know that we all come from different backgrounds. So I have to have you be aware of maybe my cultural bias with the second point of your approach. But this idea that a startup that incorporates the messaging we need to build that sense of self-worth has to be there. Right? And it might be uncomfortable for you to say, I love you, I believe you, I trust you. But incorporating that, as uncomfortable as it might be for some people, has a really strong effect. Again, I've yet to have a conversation with a young adult or an adolescent who does not want to hear that. right? So making the observations gently, being open in your questioning rather than closed, not interrogating, but rather leading with curiosity, can be a lot gentler of an approach that hopefully leaves you in a situation where you can have an open conversation, right? I think a big key takeaway, you can't change who they are, but you can change how they are it. Okay, cruising along. Be cognizant of the time here. We're trying to increase the odds, right? So it's great that they can teach you, but you need to do some learning too. And thankfully we have this tool that can help us with that. We know that consistency builds that safety. So trying to be consistent in your messaging is building that foundation that you need. Be a police person in the house, right? Enforce zero tolerance for disrespect, right? Siblings, guests in the home. I mean, it should not be disrespecting your child, and that space at home needs to be the one space that they can feel safe because you have that control over it. Being open to their decisions, right? And I know this is all dependent on the situation, so I can't give any sweeping advice about specifics, but we need them to explore so that they can figure this out. And of course, it's age appropriate, and that's for you to decide as a parent. You know, and the last one is just the guilt as a parenting tool. I mean, none of us are perfect, but trying to avoid turning it into something that affects you rather than them is always a good starting point, right? Some of this consistent messaging could sound like this. Hey, it's okay to not know everything right now. I know you're not choosing to be this way on purpose. I've yet to meet a lot of adolescents that really like to stand out. I think most of the time they want to fit in. So this isn't a choice, a choice that they're undertaking to just be different and be difficult. I'm coming from a place of curiosity, not interrogation. Oops, sorry, my child, I made a mistake. Please help me next time. Right? And let me follow your lead on this. I am ready to talk to you whenever you want. So if you want to continue to progress with them, there are ways that you can be aware and be there for them as they explore their identity. The awareness piece, has multiple components. Maybe I'll start with the majority concern. Not to scare you, but we know that this population has a significant increase in terms of prevalence of mood disorder, suicidal ideations, self-harm, especially when there's a disconnect at home and a lack of support. So on a majority level, there are some differences with mental health. On a minority level, your young person is facing what we call minority stress every day. It's socially based, and it is a result of being in a minority group. They are in the world constantly having to navigate this difference. Maybe they're uncomfortable in a particular bathroom. Maybe people are using the wrong pronoun and they constantly have to, address that and correct people. This minority stress plays a significant toll on their health, right? So just being aware of that, and also how important it is to not delay. Ignoring it will not make it go away. Focus on your studies, and you can figure this out later. We understand that ages 12 to 20 theoretically are this time of identity development, and we cannot just push that aside for studying, for all of those other things, right? This is part of it. As a parent, you can help find congruence, and congruence is this idea that what is on the inside of your child's sense of self can match what is happening on the outside, right? This is what we're trying to achieve. You can keep your eye open for role models. If you share what you're going through with friends and peers and family, you might find out that there are other people who have young people in the same situation that you do. We want to build community around this, not hide. Use the terms that they ask you to use. They might want to explore and experiment with another name. Be open to that and attempt to be there in that way. Help them find professionals. There are counselors like myself who can help navigate the mental health concerns that come along with this sometimes. There are medical professionals that I can refer you to who are endocrinologists, I can't speak too many words tonight, who can navigate questions around hormones and so on and so forth. You can support their desire to try different clothes, different hairstyles. Binding is clothing that is compression in nature. So people will wear it to compress their breasts and have them less visible. Whereas packing would be using some sort of phallic shaped object to wear if you are more closely identifying traditionally as a man, right? So there are ways that you can not impact your body beyond just expression to explore. And a great one is observing the media. There's so much in the media now that is demonstrating this range of humanity and what great talking points, right? And just observing day-to-day people and the way they express themselves might be less threatening than sitting your child down and asking all those questions. I couldn't help but include a picture of Prince for those of you that can remember back to the gender bending 80s in music. He was very much fluid in his expression of gender. Okay, so we're nearing the end here. It's important to know that these challenges are unique, but they're not pathological. And counseling is not required. And I'm not trying to put myself out of business because I love what I do. But when we find counseling helpful is when the mental health issues that may come out of this become problematic, right? And often we get into this conversation, it's like a chicken, what came first? Was it the chicken or was it the egg? What do we work with first? The gender, the congruence, the struggles with sexual identity, or the clinical issues that arise because of it? And it's difficult. I work with someone who's self-harming, and we remove that coping mechanism. And then the incongruence is amplified, right? And so what I find is a slow progression down both at the same time, right? How can you explore who you are while still working on removing these unhelpful coping mechanisms? It's tricky. You might have heard language around dysphoria. We use this for gender. It is a psychiatrist's term. It is a DSM diagnostic label. I don't work with young people, if it's any consolation or just interesting to know. I don't work with young people who are diagnostically dysphoric. I'm just working with young people who are diverse and human, and they're not at a point where those feelings are so intense that they can't manage day to day. The last bit, it's a unique challenge because your role as a parent is vital. Right? And I use the word baggage casually, but how you approach these topics will have a significant impact. Most of the conversations in the counseling room revolve around those relationships that young people have, be it with the family or friends, and how they're navigating these topics with them. This is, I think, familiar for most parents of adolescents. What are those signs that you should ask for help? The things around change, right? Be it behavior, mood, withdrawal, all of these changes, if it's significant and inexplicable, reach out and ask for help. I put a little asterisk next to the poor focus because right now we're seeing this phenomenon with the Zoom fatigue, and even really advanced, committed, not even advanced, but really committed students are struggling to focus with remote learning. So just, be aware of the Zoom fatigue there. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. Locally, the TGR is a resource center that is somewhat well established. I've been in regular conversation or correspondence with the woman who runs it. They have some bilingual available resources, not a lot. As far as LGBTQ groups in Hong Kong, most are organized and run for adults, and these are the ones that are more public. I think in terms of youth, the school counselor and the school groups, that's where it's at in terms of those connections, right? There is available support in this city, and I've obviously just started to touch on it, but as always, I encourage you to utilize the resources that the school has set up. I am happy again to help you find what you need. So open to emails for be it medical professionals or mental health care providers, groups, you name it, I'm happy to help. Big groups that you can dig into, our originals, PFLAG and GLAD. There's a couple of Canadian websites that I like to send people to as well that are quite helpful. If you're really interested in gender, WPATH is the source that mental health care professionals and medical professionals go to. They are currently revising their protocol for the care of transgendered individuals. Really interesting, or at least I find it really interesting. So I would recommend taking a look there just to see what those who are in the field of study and who are informing practice are deciding on. Right. Okay, last couple of slides. Absolutely, in terms of gender, Stephanie Brill's work I can't find anything better. Every possible question that I have ever had or conversation I've ever wondered about is in her work. Gender Board, Gender Made is very interesting as well, just different approaches to parenting, your non-conforming child. And then I don't know, this is sort of a flashback a little bit before my time, a really significant text out of the feminist movement in the States about, taking ownership of women's health and our bodies, and has been sort of aptly titled in a more recent text called Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. I'd say this is a bit more geared towards young adults, but it's really laced with advocacy and really progressive insight into what it means to be transgender, but super informative, especially if you have a lot to learn. So again, Brill's work is fantastic, and I can share all this with you. Could even lend you the book if you promise to return it, and as well as the Trans Body, Trans Selves. So there we are with 7 minutes to spare. I appreciate you being talked at for 53 minutes. I know it's a lot. I'm sure you gave up on some really exciting evening plans tonight to come here. But yeah.
Questions. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I thought it was worth kind of spending the time there to explore those resources because we've only had 2 questions. So our first question is, what is your view on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which affects mostly young women? Do you think it makes sense that young girls would be disturbed by typical gender expectations, given that many can be very negative? And the example that this parent has given is not being sporty, for example.
Okay, sorry. Could you read the question again? It's quite late. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. So what is your view on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which affects mostly young women? Do you think it makes sense that it does affect mostly young women?
No, I can't speak to that. I don't want to speak to that in a way that generalizes, because I'm not seeing that here, and I'm not working with, I guess I could say, an imbalance in cases, and I'm not seeing more young women than young men. And what do you mean by, what was the part about being sporty?
Do you think that it makes sense that young girls would be disturbed by typical gender expectations rather, given that many can be very negative? So are kind of gender expectations of girls more negative than that of boys typically? And could that be affecting that balance?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I'm hearing just as much in terms of pressure that young boys feel. There's no difference in terms of body image expectations, body composition. So again, I can't speak to that statistic. I'm unaware of that being more prominent or present in young women, but I could definitely look into that and follow up if that's something that that particular parent wants to explore.
And I don't know if Calvin or Claire had anything to say on that, but I know from me in the medical room, I think they might present in different ways, but actually their thoughts and their feelings towards gender and their identity are very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So our next question is, and you touched on this slightly in your slide on pathology, but does congruence include kind of like hormonal or surgical treatments for minors? Like at what point do we get to that stage?
Well, again, I can't ethically and personally, I can't lead anyone down any path. I know in Hong Kong, the doctors that I have been in contact with, around age 16 are open to conversations with the child and parents, but there are some legal, limits. 18 is typically considered an autonomous adult, but again, I can't lead anyone down any particular path. But yes, congruence includes hormonal treatment and body modification and altercation, right? And so for some people, that level of congruence needs to be achieved in order to feel that sense of wholeness. And for some people, they're happy to, carry on throughout life without possible body modifications. Some people undertake voice therapy and find that might be enough. So it really is individual, but there are medical professionals in this city who either are private or public, where they sit in terms of healthcare that are, working in this field.
Thank you for that. And our next question was probably a bit more directed to Claire and Calvin and maybe me, but what role does or can school play in supporting young people who are exploring their gender?
I mean, I'm sure Stephanie will join in with this. It is a partnership, and it's just very, very small steps, and there's no rush. I think it's what Stephanie was saying before about carving out a space for a young person to explore, discuss, and question, and move at that child's pace. Actually, Stephanie, I'm sure you'll add to this, but it's certainly something that we work, with parents and their child with. And if a child wants to explore a different pronoun, that's something that we're happy to explore with that young person. If they want to explore wearing their school uniform differently and things like that, we will work with the child and the parents. And we're also aware that for parents, myself as a parent included, this can be quite overwhelming and a very new experience and a journey that might seem a bit scary, because you don't, and there's so much, Stephanie, that you've shared with tonight, so many names, etc. And we've also been teaching this with students in year 10 who find it equally fascinating and a new world of language. But you said, I think it really struck with me, we're going to make mistakes. And don't be afraid to make mistakes, but if you do, own it. And I think there's just got to be those open conversations and the power of vulnerability. So from a school point of view, there's a very positive partnership with parents and the child.
Thank you. And that's all the questions we have. So I think I'm taking away that gender is not new to our narrative. I'm taking away that gender is new to our narrative, not new to our world. And I'll be using that, and I'll be quoting you, Stephanie. And some it's newer than others, and that's okay. So I hope you really had some useful takeaways this evening. So pleased to have Stephanie here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me and allowing this space. Really appreciate it.
So as you exit, please fill out the poll and the feedback, and we really do welcome your feedback. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good evening.